Hi, and welcome to the Vocal Fries Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
And I just got to see you in person, Carrie.
I know, yeah. You got to see Vancouver in all its sunny glory.
I know. It was sunny the entire time I was there, which I hear is lucky.
Especially June.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if people don't know, we don't record this podcast together. We record it in different countries. So we haven't seen each other in person in a while.
It's true. Yeah, that was the first time since early 2022. So yeah, it was fun.
It was fun.
What was your favorite bit about Vancouver?
The weather. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's true.
I got really lucky.
In comparison, especially to Arizona at that moment in time, too.
Yeah, it was like 109 or something back home when I was there. So, yeah, the weather was, 68 degrees to 75 degrees the entire time I was there.
Yeah.
It was perfect.
It was really nice. So, yeah.
And I liked being around water.
Mm-hmm. That's the thing I miss the most in Phoenix. It's there's that river.
Yeah.
The town lake, quote unquote.
Right.
And some canals, but yeah, I definitely missed the water when I was there.
I can see why. Definitely see why now.
One of our patrons always sends us interesting things, and this is very timely.
Okay.
I have not been paying much attention to the Stanley Cup, which for those who don't know, that's the hockey thing.
It's a hockey thing, and you haven't been paying attention because the Canucks are out, right?
I just haven't really been paying that much attention. I paid a little bit more attention when, the Canucks were in it. But I didn't watch any games. I was just, it's hard to avoid when you're in a hockey city and everyone is talking about it around you.
Right.
But, so I knew the Canucks were doing really well this season, and then they lost to Edmonton, the Oilers. So then the Oilers have been in the finals with the Florida Panthers.
Okay.
And so I was not paying attention. I did not realize that the Florida Panthers won 3 games in a row. If I had been paying attention, I would have been like, oh, well, the Oilers are out of it then.
Right.
But no, they're still in it. It's now 3-3. So They are going to the final game.
They both won 3 in a row.
Yep. Which I don't think happens very often.
No.
I think it's maybe happened once before. I think they were saying on CBC yesterday. I can't remember. It doesn't really matter. But anyway, I was like, cool. All right. Kind of fun.
Yeah.
But that's not really the reason why I want to talk about it.
Okay.
The real reason is that the Stanley Cup final, so I assume all 7 games, have been broadcast or will be broadcast in American Sign Language for the first time.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
So simulcast? It's on the screen with everything, or?
It must be, right? I don't know how else they would do it, but the NHL and PXP have created, quote, NHL in ASL, which is available on ESPN Plus and Sportsnet Plus. So both in Canada and the United States.
That is really neat.
And it's the first fully immersive viewing experience for the deaf community by Professional Sports League. That's what this article says. So that's pretty cool.
That is really cool. That is not what I thought you were going to say.
What did you think I was going to talk about?
I don't know. I was like, okay, it has to do with language. What is it going to, is it going to have to be something with the names of the play or something? But that it's being simulcast in ASL is fantastic.
Yeah.
That's great news.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the NHL has been or at least some... Well, I guess it's mostly maybe CBC. I can't remember. But there's definitely been some broadcasting in other languages besides English and French. Punjabi and Cree.
Oh.
Could be others as well. I'm not sure. Those are the 2 I'm aware of. And now ASL. So, yeah. Expanding the repertoire. I think it's great.
It's fantastic. And there's not many that ML, thinking about baseball, the basketball, they can't say the same. I don't think they can say the same about the simulcast, and certainly not in ASL, but I don't know in other languages.
Maybe Spanish.
Maybe. Oh, yeah, Spanish, yeah.
For baseball, for sure. It's got to be, right?
Yeah.
Probably the other ones, probably all the other sports, too. But I don't know. And then, I don't know of any other.
Not football. Well, no.
Maybe?
But again, it would be Spanish. It would only be Spanish if they even...
Right. Probably. Yeah. My guess is if there's any other language, it it would be Spanish, and that might not even be Spanish. I just assume that it must be, but I honestly don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because I'm not really that much on the sports, side of things. It's not that I avoid it completely, but it's just not my passion.
I know, like, the Phoenix Suns have a jersey that says the Los Suns sometimes for, like, Mexican Heritage Night and stuff like that, but it might be simulcast in, like, radio in Spanish, I'm thinking.
It could be. I really honestly don't know.
Yeah.
Because I've never thought about it that much. Partially, again, because I don't...
You don't watch those sports?
Do not watch basketball.
Yeah.
I don't watch basketball. I find it incredibly boring. I apologize to all the basketball fans out there. I'm like, the last 5 minutes... That's enough for me.
Yeah. Yeah. You must feel the same way about baseball.
Oh my god, baseball is maybe even more boring.
Yeah.
It's such a long game.
If you think basketball's boring, you gotta think baseball's boring.
Oh my god, it takes forever. I've been to a few in-person games. Like, I went to see the Blue Jays in Toronto one year. This is many years ago.
Yeah.
Now, I saw two Diamondbacks. I saw two Diamondbacks games. Both of them, I was like halfway through, like, oh my god, I'm ready to go. The games are just too long. I did go to a local game here, so like the minor league. We have a minor league game, the Canadians in Vancouver. That was better because it was only 7 innings.
Okay.
And also at the halfway point, approximately halfway point, they had these sushi pieces running around the field, like these human stress of sushi pieces. And so I was like, okay, that's so cute. Like, it was just like way more like local and fun and like, I don't know.
Yeah, anyway. That's cute.
So if I'm going to watch baseball, it's going to be 7 innings. It's going to be minor league.
Yeah. That's funny.
They're usually 9. It was only short because they had a doubleheader. But anyway.
Well, very, very, very cool. I'm glad that was such a timely thing.
Right? So, so if you're listening to this, you might be about to watch the final game, or you might have already seen the final game, or you might not care about hockey at all. But anyway, I just think it's kind of cool that, and I do feel like hockey is on the forefront of this stuff, or at least some of the broadcasters that broadcast the sports. So that's fun.
Yeah, it's definitely fun. It's really neat.
Yeah, and today we talk all about languages and maps and New York City.
Yeah. It's very, very neat.
It was fun.
Yeah. And there's a book that you can check out.
And an online map, an interactive map.
That Carrie loves.
Fun.
Yeah.
Yes, I definitely love. I love maps, especially interactive maps.
Absolutely.
So yeah, have fun.
Yeah, hope you enjoy. So today we are so excited to have Ross Perlin, who is a linguist, writer, and translator, and native New Yorker. He has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, and N+1. He is the co-director of the Manhattan-based nonprofit Endangered Language Alliance, which has been covered by the New York Times, The New Yorker, BBC, NPR, and many others. He is the author of Intern Nation, How to Learn Nothing and Earn Little in the Brave New Economy. And he is also the author of Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, which is what he's here to talk about with us today. So thank you so much for being here, Ross.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, so thank you so much for writing this beautiful book.
Thank you.
So will you tell us a little bit about the Endangered Language Alliance?
Sure. So we're a nonprofit based in New York. We've been around since 2010. It was founded originally by my current co-director, Daniel Kaufman, and another linguist, Juliette Blevins, and a Pullman, but really came about as the result of New Yorkers from all walks of life realizing that the city had become unprecedentedly diverse linguistically, especially, as have so many other cities, but that there was actually something that linguists, language activists, ordinary New Yorkers could do by sort of working in partnership to try to document that diversity and support it and try to see it thrive. So at the time, I was actually finishing up my PhD fieldwork in China, but then I came back home to New York, which is where I'm from, and it had been going for just a couple of years. And it's, in some ways, a shoestring nonprofit that has always kind of improvises from year to year, but it's grown into something of kind of an extended family of a large number of people who care about urban linguistic diversity. So we do a whole variety of things. Some of it is kind of classic language documentation, has a more even academic focus about working with speakers to document their languages, because indeed there are speakers of many languages that have been sort of little recorded and little described who have come in recent years to New York. But then some of the work is much more towards language revitalization and maintenance. It could be publishing children's books, hosting classes in language and health, public policy, working with city agencies. So there's a whole kind of variety of things that have just developed over the years.
So how is the Endangered Language Alliance different from traditional linguistic fieldwork?
It's different, starting with the fact that we're in a city, right? We're working in a diaspora context, primarily with diaspora and immigrant communities. So for my PhD work, going to Southwest China, was doing sort of more of that traditional work where somebody goes from far away to a distant mountainous region in this case. And I was there for several years, but then ultimately I had to come home. And I think there's something different here in this sort of open-ended way that we're able to work as neighbors for the long haul with communities that are themselves have been uprooted for various reasons. So part of it is that sort of the diasporic nature of it. Of course, there are certain downsides as well, right? I mean, there's good reason why people try to go to the home region of a language if possible and see it in its fundamental or older setting, natural world, the built environment. Those are things that transform through migration. So we try to actually work, and I talk about this in Language City, we try to work in both places and go often, back to a home region with members of the community who may be in New York and sort of document in multiple sites. But there are also certain advantages, I think, to working in cities. You have all of the, besides the long-term partnership aspect, you have all the resources of a big city. You have artists, universities, students, policymakers, all kinds of things that are concentrated in the resources of a city.
Yeah, so speaking of the city, let's talk about the book. Why did you want to write this book and why now?
The book grew out of just what's now more than a decade of work at the Endangered Language Alliance. And in some ways, I had thought that, this is amazing. This is lifetimes of work here when we got started in early 2010s, and that this would just keep going and growing and ever more diversifying. Of course, threats to languages obviously are global, and language endangerment was motivating a lot of what we were doing. But I think it was really only after 2016, anti-immigrant politics, then COVID, that the threats to cities like New York and to multilingual communities became more and more evident to me, and the question of whether this could be peak linguistic diversity, that actually from here, for various reasons, all of these different threats, that this moment might not last forever, and that not only should we be doing the work, but we should also be creating a sort of a document of the work and trying to sort of crystallize it in some sense while possible. So I think there are all sorts of urgencies now. Immigration is obviously part of it. This has become one of the salient political issues of our time. Election, we're in the 100th anniversary of America kind of closing its doors to much of the world, and could see that happen again. In terms of language endangerment, it's likewise, there are, of course, amazing efforts in terms of language revitalization and maintenance, but language endangerment is also a sort of a deepening process. And, a couple of decades into linguists being very involved with this in an organized way through language documentation and other things, I felt that the role of cities had not been emphasized enough, and that if languages are going to have a future, cities have to be part of that equation. They shouldn't just be seen as places of loss and of contact, however fascinating, or sites for certain kinds of sociolinguistic research, but also places where primarily oral, minority, and indigenous languages can also have a future.
That's a great point to ask this question. So, how would you describe the linguistic life of New York City?
There's no question that language loss and shift have been a pervasive feature of the city's linguistic history, like so many cities, right? And I try to give, in the book is sort of structured around this idea that, contemporary New York may be, as we've documented at least, the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. And sort of describing the past, present, and future of that city. How did that come to be? And in the case of New York, the story begins with Lenape, the indigenous language of this archipelago where the city is now. And then you have we're in the 400th anniversary, actually, of this colonial founding of the city by the Dutch West India Company. which established a sort of, not a colony in quite the same sense as these other 12 colonies that were English speaking, if not English only, but actually a sort of multilingual entrepot where Dutch came to serve as a lingua franca, but a whole range of other languages were spoken from the get-go, Native American languages, as well as a variety of European languages. So the template was set, and then the history of the city has been, for these 4 centuries, just a continuous history of being this premier immigration gateway. And of course, there has waxed and waned. And I think in recent decades, more and more cities have diversified along perhaps similar lines. But New York has been at it for all these centuries. And the deep linguistic life of the city, I think language as a lens onto these processes of immigration and diaspora kind of goes beyond the nation state labels, which in many cases, right, these nation states didn't exist at the time when people were migrating, and actually understanding how that the city is patterned along ethno-linguistic lines, and that these arrangements these forces have really shaped the city in fundamental ways, the actual languages that people spoke and the groups that they're from, as a sort of insight into the very specific connections between places on the other side of the world and New York. So this has all sort of gone into the makeup of the city in ways that I don't think, the histories of cities that are usually written don't really capture this, because these are primarily oral languages, and the histories end up following the largest languages with the written sources. But I think it's a fundamental story of the city, linguistic diversity, and to the story of all cities, perhaps. But at the same time, it is a story, there has been continual sort of loss and shift and contact. However fascinating, there are extraordinary cases of survival and persistence, but at the same time, there's been an underappreciation and inability to sort of build a linguistic infrastructure to appreciate, develop, and support all of this linguistic diversity that's coming here. And that's what I hope that the Endangered Language Alliance and this book are part of a new attempt to build that.
Yeah, and you refer to New York as a Babel in reverse. Can you tell us a little bit about what you mean?
The myth of Babel, as all linguists know, is one that just, for those who kind of come from, I guess, the Abrahamic faiths in some way culturally, right? We can't get away from Babel as this idea that linguistic diversity was a curse. And of course, in the story of Babel, as we hear it, the languages are sort of confounded, and diversification is imposed by God as a curse. And actually, the reversal here is that sort of the Babel is being created because everybody is coming here, the sort of the blessing of linguistic diversity, but actually it's a monoculture that is being created. That is sort of the curse in some ways. So it is, many will say, of course, New York and other such cities are these Babels, but it's sort of a reversal of the original idea.
And so, speaking of some of these languages, what is Harlemese, and how did it affect the English of New York City?
Yeah, contact languages and mixed languages and particular varieties that have grown up in New York are among the most fascinating parts of the story, I think, because of the way that you not only have peoples kind of coming from all over, very particular places, but far-flung all over, but then also living within a few blocks of one another and being completely kind of in contact with one another. So this idea of Harlemese, and this isn't my term, but was coined by some of the great writers of the Harlem Renaissance. Of course, everybody kind of has an awareness of the Harlem Renaissance as this great artistic and literary movement. But the linguistic side of it was that you had the creation of kind of this new Black diaspora capital, where you had the great migration of African Americans coming from the South, you had Caribbean migration, and you had the initial stages of migration directly from Africa as well at that time. And so what was happening in Harlem in the 1920s during that kind of Renaissance period was the formation of this kind of, sort of a mixed language. Some would call it just slang or an argot, but it deeply kind of informed American popular culture and American English. It reflected this kind of African diaspora capital that was coming into being, as well as the particular dynamics of Harlem life, right? Like the world of jazz clubs and the world of the rent parties, and gave us a lot of terms that are still kind of in circulation today.
Is Harlemese still spoken?
I think the term is no longer used as such. And actually, I think just sort of became so pervasive in some ways that we barely notice it. But arguably it's been succeeded by sort of different iterations, just as, I mean, of course, jazz is still with us, right? The music, some of the musical analogs, but actually now it's kind of the language that came along with and is tied to hip hop, for instance. So, and sort of geographically, of course, there's movement around the city. Harlem was the sort of center. At that point, later it becomes, in some ways, at least the capitals of Black life, demographically speaking, in New York, become, Brooklyn, Bronx, and elsewhere. So I don't know if we'd say that Harlemese itself is still spoken, but I think what we could say is that the sort of like dynamic processes of language contact in this Black diaspora capital are kind of continuing to ramify and change and spread.
And could you give us some examples of Harlemese that snuck into English?
Some great kind of dictionaries that were created by these Harlem Renaissance figures. I mean, some have said that hot, as in a sort of like sexual term, like, he's hot, she's hot, like actually was kind of coming out of that language. That certain kind of like jive talk and kind of phrases associated with jazz and music also came out of it. I give some examples in the book, but it's really worth looking at, like Cab Calloway, who himself was a famous jazz band leader. He did I think it's called a Hipster's Dictionary. And then actually even the term like hip and hipster is one that kind of probably ultimately comes out of that milieu also.
Wow.
I love that, especially considering how hipsters use now.
Yeah.
Totally different, right? I mean, nobody has really, some of these etymologies are really hard to like pin down or trace to one person, but definitely the word hip is kind of popularized and spreads out of this environment.
So what are some of the forces that are threatening linguistic diversity in New York City? And are these the same forces that want to limit immigration?
I think there are a number of things going on. The forces that threaten linguistic diversity worldwide, of course, are also operative here, right? The pressures of media, technology, and education systems. And, they're in some cases very well-meaning. And it's actually not always just pressure directly from English. It often is pressure from Spanish or Russian or Nepali or other large languages which are spoken by huge communities here that people, are sort of maybe embedded within. So, yeah, I would say that in New York, certainly at the moment with the so-called migrant crisis, which has now brought close to 200,000 people here just in the last couple of years and has intersected with our shelter system and a housing crisis, sort of shaking this. But by and large, there is a deep kind of, I would say, pro-immigrant kind of politics and consensus that has long been part of New York life. And I think this is true of a number of other large cities that have been fueled by immigration, because close to 40% of all New Yorkers were born in another country, and most of the rest had an immigrant parent or grandparent. So I would say that still the baseline feeling is very much sees the value of immigration and sympathizes and understands, that this is a fundamental part of the city, right? But those forces, I think, that are threatening immigration, they are kind of in places that are experiencing some of this diversification now for the first time, or only in recent years, perhaps. I've sort of forgotten that this is at the base of mobility, is at the basis of the nation and the world. So I think there are sort of different things going on, but certainly the pressures have mounted, and language sometimes becomes a flashpoint, just because, especially for a monolingual English speaker, let's say, somebody like Donald Trump, who's been talking just in the last couple of months, right, about truly foreign languages coming into our country, where the sound of another language almost seems to just rattle him and bring out all of his fears and insecurities. And he seems to be trying to sort of play that up. So it's really about other anxieties. Obviously, it's not about language. It's not about, oh yeah, they have a subjunctive and we don't,
Yes.
or we do, but it's not as overtly, marked or used. But yeah, it's a delicate and difficult moment.
Yeah. So speaking of Trump, how would his reelection, heaven forfend, affect speakers of endangered languages in New York, do you think?
Heaven forfend, yeah. I mean, we saw and were involved working with a lot of different communities, doing a lot of different things during 2016 to 2020, and it was a deeply challenging period where many people, whether with documents or not, were living in a great deal of fear, and the sense that linguistic communities here as elsewhere have depended on sort of their transnational or translocal contacts with their home communities, on the ability to have kind of family reunification, to have new arrivals from those communities kind of replenishing and supporting the language. And once all those things are kind of under threat, it kind of can choke off and break down some of those communities. I mean, certainly some people in some communities were actually able to sort of double down and rally and so on, but the challenges are already so immense that we could, we're used to the idea, the world is continually getting more and more diverse, and we'll see more and more, people from all over the world coming and sort of enriching our neighborhoods, our cultural life, our culinary life, all of this. And I think that it really could drastically kind of go in the other direction, to go backwards if we had another Trump term. And he, among all the executive orders during that first term, proposed kind of immigration, so-called reforms, some of them had a linguistic side where actually, if you don't speak English, you were going to be prevented from being able to migrate, or you were going to be in a difficult situation. And that has never been a feature of immigration to this country, which has always depended on other factors. But language, and this is coming out of the English only movement, right, which is now kind of been going for a few decades, and is also in some ways, I would say, really kind of a new force in American life, because historically we have been such a multilingual place, but that English only kind of movement may finally then get a place in the White House, and who knows what that could lead to.
Yeah, I don't want to either. Yeah, it's horrifying.
It was bad enough the first time around.
Did you notice it affect your work at the Endangered Language Alliance during his first administration?
Yeah, it definitely kind of helped to shift our focus, which I think was a good thing. And of course, there's always work to do on, the grammar of a language. And we want to work on this dictionary and get into more technical sides of language. In some cases, that speakers themselves are interested. The focus did kind of have to shift, and then it even more so during COVID, to things that were really kind of like affecting people immediately. And we were starting to record Know Your Rights, PSAs in different languages, and sort of like addressing all the different concerns and uncertainties about deportation and travel and employment and all these things that we suddenly, access to information, interpretation, all those things came much more to the fore.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So speaking of things like that, how are linguists and speakers fighting back?
A variety of ways. I think we are seeing in some ways like an unprecedented push to try to have better access to interpretation and translation, deepening kind of language policy, where even 10, 20 years ago, there was a lot less in terms of cities and states saying that they'll at least support the largest non-English languages in their areas. So, we've seen the formation we've been part of the formation of an Indigenous interpreters co-op here, especially focused on Indigenous Latin American languages, but a lot of that is interpretation for immigration courts, and having to do with like really life or death types of issues. And then those PSAs and health stuff during the height of the pandemic. Multilingual immigrant communities in New York were kind of at the epicenter of the epicenter, because there were many who were essential workers living in overcrowded housing, didn't have access to information in their languages about the fast changing health situation. So all those things have led to, I think, more of a push and an awareness like that we have to do this, have to have more of that kind of linguistic infrastructure in place. Just, we have other types of infrastructure. Like this is crucial for just everything. But yeah, I think it's still kind of early days and few resources to really do the work. So it still is kind of a big uphill battle, but I think there is a lot more focus on trying to make messages, on trying to engage. We see city agencies like the Department of Health and the Department of Education, the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, and occasionally in other places outside New York as well, really like realizing that they need to engage in not just the few largest languages, but find strategies to reach communities kind of where they are, even in primarily oral languages, Indigenous languages. We're seeing, there's much more than there was even a decade ago, even if it's still small compared to the need.
What would you like to see the Endangered Language Alliance do next?
There are so many projects on the docket. I try to talk a little bit about it in Language City. I mean, just trying to run a nonprofit in the world, not really tied to any university. I mean, I teach at some linguistics at Columbia, and my co-director also teaches at Queen's College, but like would love to have like a real staff where we could hire linguistics graduates and all that stuff to really kind of be able to have more consistent ongoing programs. But I think the dream is to be a major kind of partner in the building of that kind of linguistic infrastructure for the city and other cities. So we've done all this work mapping the languages of New York, which kind of fed into the book, and check out our digital version of that language map at languagemap.nyc, which shows over 700 language varieties that are spoken all over the metropolitan area, recordings for many of them, stories, and so on. Even just kind of maintaining we did that sort of linguistic census because the Census Bureau doesn't do a good job with language, right? They just cover the largest languages. So even the data is kind of like missing. And so we have tried to kind of fill that gap, but we know there's a lot of interest in doing it in other cities. We try to support some of these nascent efforts in other places, and our ability to do that is limited. The ability of linguists and others in those places to do that mapping is limited. But then even now that we have the map as a tool to teach with, to advocate with, it's still, I think, a matter of like taking it to the next level and saying, okay, well, we have some sense of the communities here, but are we meeting their linguistic needs, whether it's for around things like bilingual education or interpretation or interest in language maintenance and revitalization? We could really be, if we had enough scale to support through there, and language activists with their linguistic choices and project. Right now it's catch as catch can, but there's so much interest and demand and desire on the part of speakers and activists.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the map making because I saw that in your bio. How did you get interested in map making as a linguist?
The first thing that happened was just that we realized that none of the communities that we were working with were represented in the census. So we kind of worked backward. We're like, well, actually, we know some of these communities have thousands of people here in New York, and they don't show up in any clear way in any official data, which was curious. But I mean, certainly there's like a, sort of a renaissance of mapping right now, right? Where so many people are interested in creating cool maps and doing sort of spatial visualization of complex phenomena. And certainly, language mapping poses all kinds of interesting challenges, which we've written about. It's not easy to kind of determine how do you represent something as fluid and dynamic as language, right? But I think that it's a way of understanding linguistic geography of the city that can appeal to a wide audience and sort of bring a lot of people in and sort of visibilize, as it were, a lot of communities which are not visible or not audible to outsiders or to policymakers. So I think it's a really important tool and we've really had a great kind of reception for this work, for kind of showing what the linguistic diversity of the city looks like, and that it's not just completely ineffable, but you can kind of picture it, have an image of it, and then also that's something that one can work with. It was useful during, the peak of COVID, and then for other challenges. This is actually like a tool for city agencies and other nonprofits and language activists to use to say, like, okay, this at least kind of gives us a sense of where people are, and then also, that it's not random, that there is a story to why communities settle in one place versus another, and what kinds of language contact phenomena can be kind of read off the map and then investigated. And there's just so many kind of intricacies about the patterning and structuring of linguistic diversity in the density of an urban area, particular challenges that are quite different from the idea of like, okay, let's make a language map of the world where we have this polygon and that polygon and these pieces of territory. Here, it's like in a single building on a single block that you're seeing so many languages kind of in contact and next to each other.
Yeah. So speaking of that, like you represent, each dot represents a language in a particular location. How do you choose like this location is significant?
It's a challenge. Yeah. These are significant sites. I mean, there's so many decisions of representation that go into this kind of mapping, and it's not perfect by any means. And, it's always changing. We try to stay current. It really grew out of, at this point, thousands of conversations with community leaders, language activists, speakers about what are the significant sites for your language. And then a certain set of constraints that we felt were important just from the get-go, including the fact that the map is really meant for the lesser known languages. So we wouldn't be putting every significant English speaking site or Spanish speaking or Bengali speaking site. So we kind of like limited those to one per borough, basically, or, some very basic constraints. But then like with the smaller languages that, are not on the census, we've also built the census data into the map. There's a tab for that, and you can look at that. And it's useful for the top few dozen languages, but for the other nearly 700, it was a matter of having those discussions and saying, well, is it this religious institution or this hometown association? I'm really fascinated by and talk quite a bit in the book about these hometown associations, of which there are thousands in the city, which I think are really sort of the bedrock of the immigrant city, because they represent particular places, often kind of linguistically keyed to languages that people are from, that people have migrated from, a particular valley in Nepal where a particular language is spoken, who have a association in a particular place in Queens, right? So those are very kind of clear cases, like there is a clear gathering point. In some cases, it might be a religious institution. It could be a restaurant, a community center. It could be a residential enclave, a building. We also had to obviously respect privacy and sort of fuzz the locations a little bit. These are mostly places that do have some kind of, there is some kind of public information, like this is an association that has this address. It's not necessarily a place like where we're telling people like go knock on the door. So that's the privacy side of it. But I think it does, getting to these significant sites does kind of, and we have, it's not just one per language, right? It's a number, but I think it does get at something about the way that people sort of see and obviously it reflects the limits of what we could do. We're not the Census Bureau, right? We can't sort of have a huge response where we're mapping actually all the residential. I don't know if we would want to. So I think it does get at something very interesting and useful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I absolutely love this map. I'm so excited to be playing around with it.
Cool.
I really do love maps, especially interactive ones. But
oh, yeah.
So I wanted to make sure to ask about the people behind these languages. You write that the story of a city's least known languages is also the story of its forgotten peoples, told in their own words and translation where needed. Thank you for sharing the stories of speakers of endangered languages with us through your book. What have you learned from these speakers?
Well, thank you. Yeah, the book is structured where there's this linguistic history of the city, but then the core of it is really the portraits of these 6 different speakers of different languages in very different situations from all over the world, including Lenape, the original language of this place, but then also a variety of different situations. And so, what I wanted to do is really kind of try to show the city as they see it, their portion of, that their world, not just the city, but where they're coming from, the details of their migration stories, of their language work, and to include big chunks of their languages. The audiobook also has some of them reading certain passages as well that are in the languages. I try to have, translation is not a secondary aspect of the book. It's baked into it, right? Like English is in italics, not many other languages which are woven through it.
Yeah. I loved that choice.
Oh, yeah, I think I think it's trying to kind of embody the ideas that it's talking about. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in these speakers who are people that I've known for years. And like, how did I choose them is always a question. Well, it grew out of particular relationships over time, right? And people that we've worked with a lot of different people in different ways, but these were both a group of people that kind of came from all over and represented different situations, but also people that I just know and trust and deeply care about and that we've worked with. So I think each one of them, I hope, has something kind of different to teach us about, whether it's Ibrahima, the activist for UNCO, this West African writing system, who, worries about getting the system into, this writing system into Unicode and how it's going to come out on different software platforms, and social media is kind of this eternal beta tester language. And when he's sort of teaching about writing and technology, versus Irwin, who is a Nahuatl speaking chef, from Puebla in Mexico, but has been cooking with the language and kind of almost like recovering the etymologies behind Mexican cuisine, right? Where almost all of the key words are actually Nahuatl origin words. So I think that each person kind of featured in the book has things to teach us about language and life.
That's awesome. Someone that I work with, she just finished her master's, and she created this like resource for speakers of her language, Squamish, and it involves like some cooking, some recipes, some like stories, some like a little bit of linguistics. I think it's just really cool. So I love, the connection with food and language.
Oh yeah, food is the way in.
Yes,
it's a universal, right? So much there.
There's so much there. But yeah, so is there anything else you want to like let our listeners know about either the book or endangered languages or whatever work you do?
No, I would just say I hope people enjoy Language City. I hope they check out the Endangered Language Alliance. I hope they hear where they're living in a different way. I hope you just kind of are able to open your ears to the linguistic diversity that's actually like right around us. It's not just on the other side of the world. It's actually right here in towns and cities all around us where we're living. So that's what I hope Language City kind of opens up to.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. Thanks for doing this, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you. And
Thanks.
We always leave our listeners with one final message.
Don't be an asshole.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.